So I just chucked a scuba cylinder on my back and swimming around this relatively shallow bay, just looking for anything to see. And I came across this little reef, and it literally was covered in anemones, like thousands of clownfish and anemones wall to wall. I've never seen anything like it.
Off Gassing, a scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. At some point, most divers will come across New Zealand physician and scientist Dr. Simon Mitchell. In the slim chance you have not heard of him, do yourself a favor, find your way to a computer, conduct a Google search, and I guarantee you'll learn a thing or two. In the meantime, enjoy this interview as I sit down and get to know one of the most respected divers on the planet. Simon, how are you doing this evening for you, I guess I should say?
Yeah, no, I'm good, Nick. Yeah, you're right. It is evening here. I've just finished a fairly long day in the operating rooms, which was moderately eventful. But everyone is alive who I dealt with today, so that's the most important thing.
Awesome. And I just want to thank you very, very much for coming on to the podcast. I know you're an extremely busy person. I know we had some scheduling issues, but it's awesome to have you on here. So once again, thank you very much. And I was very much looking forward to this, still am. So this is exciting for me.
Yeah, no problem. And Nick, I love talking about diving, and so yeah, it's a pleasure.
Cool. So my first question that I always like to ask my guests is, tell me how and why you got into scuba diving. Tell me about that first breath underwater, that first experience, what led into it. Was it love at first breath, or was it something that you had to overcome? Just kind of talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's easy. So I was very lucky to grow up as a young kid in a seaside suburb in Wellington, New Zealand, where that's what the kids did. You know, we just all went snorkeling down at the local beach, which, as fate would have it, is actually a really beautiful dive site. It's a lovely rocky coastline, clear water, lots of cool things to see, and literally, like you said, love at first breath. So from the moment I went into the water, I just thought, wow, this is just so incredible. And I wanted to know everything about everything I was seeing, so I had this fascination with it. And, we used to, get in the water, freeze, get out of the water, light a fire, thaw out a bit, get back in the water, freeze again. And, like stuff you'd never do now as an adult. But, no, it was an amazing time. And so that's how I got my start. And literally from that point, and, maybe 10 years old, everything I've done since then has in some way been guided or influenced by this love of diving. So when I left school, I did marine biology. I wasn't smart enough to go to medical school straight away, or I did too much diving and not enough study is probably the explanation for it. And then, medical school, went to the Navy, became a DMO for the Navy, a diving medical officer, and after that, it was hyperbaric medicine, and but one of the cool things about diving, Nick, is that you can reinvent yourself as a diver so many times throughout a diving career. So it can start with spearfishing or snorkeling, and then spearfishing, and then scuba, and then military, a little bit of commercial stuff thrown in there, photography, technical diving. So these are all things we can talk about, but that it is an amazing thing about diving that there's so many ways that you can reinvent yourself as a diver.
So when you took your first courses, did you find it challenging, or was it just kind of like, I'm done with this course, what's the next course, how much further can I go? Was it, obviously there was a love there, so there must have been like, what more can I find out?
Yeah, the courses were, I was just like mad keen to do all of them as soon as I possibly could. So I think I did my open water scuba course. It wasn't called that then. It was the old CMAS system in New Zealand, which was a bit kind of more, Navy SEAL training type of thing back in those days. But I did that when I was 14, and I think I was a diving instructor by the time I was 17, which was, looking back on it, to be honest, Nick, it's all a bit kind of soon. But no, the courses were cool, and I just had this thirst for knowledge. I never dreamed back then that one day I would be, an influential diving physician. That was kind of like, if you'd said that to me, I would have said, "You're dreaming, mate. There's no way." But these things have a way of, working out. But yeah, I did lots of courses early on, and loved every one of them.
Oh, that's awesome. So when you were the 14 when you got your first open water certification, did you venture into that alone, or did you have some buddies to go take the course with?
Yeah, I did have some buddies. So I was, with a bunch of schoolmates, and we were like, this was a big adventure for us, and we decided we'd create a club, a diving club. And so I think we were the only club in New Zealand that was kind of all composed of all school kids. At that time, the club scene was very adult oriented, very male, of course, which it isn't now, which is terrific. And so we started this club, and we kind of worked through it all together, which was wonderful, because that's one of the things about diving, right, Nick? It's not just the time being underwater. It's a very social, interactive activity. So you spend a lot of time on boats or traveling or whatever with other people. So you meet all these cool people, and then you do things like start a club. And for kids, that was a major learning experience. Like you start a club, and like you have to have a chairman and leadership, and someone has to be the secretary and the treasurer and all that kind of stuff. And so as a growth experience for kids, diving provided us with this amazing experience, not just being underwater, but the whole package that goes with it.
Do you still dive with some of those buddies, or?
Actually, yes, I do. Although one generation on from my school club, I met a guy just as I was becoming a diving instructor, so my late teens, he'd kind of come through another group of young guys in Wellington who, they were kind of independent from us, and actually we had every reason to hate each other because we were sort of, young rivals in the sort of diving pecking order in Wellington. And actually this guy, his name's Bill Day, a wonderful bloke, and my oldest friend. So we're still very good friends. We still travel and we still go diving together. But we kind of bonded over a few beliefs we had around diving at that time. That some aspects of the instruction weren't that great, and we wanted to do our. And of course, we were seen as precocious little I would say shits, but maybe I shouldn't say that. We weren't highly regarded, but that kind of bonded us together. And so I still hang out with Bill. In fact, he became an entrepreneur and made a huge amount of money. So I now get to travel on his motor yacht all around the islands and fly in his helicopter. And meanwhile, I drive a Nissan, SUV, because I chose medicine, right? But yeah, no, we're still great mates.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Tell me a little bit about the diving in New Zealand. So I'm assuming the water is cold. I have not been to New Zealand, so I don't know much about the diving around that area.
Yeah, so you're pretty much right. It's temperate water diving, but New Zealand is quite a long country. So, we go from sort of, I guess you'd call it, from subtropical in the very north to the subantarctic in the very south. So there's quite a range of environments. And in summer, up north, you can dive with a very light wetsuit. And then down south, you pretty much need a dry suit all year round for any serious kind of diving. But it's temperate water, so it's not coral reefs. It's, walls with sponges, lots of colour, fairly spectacular topography depending on where you go. I mean, it's like any place. It's got its wonderful dive sites and its not so great dive sites, but there are one or two very famous sites in New Zealand. So anyone coming here, I would say the Poor Knights Islands, so poor as in poor, not much money, Poor Knights, Knights. Poor Knights Islands is world-class temperate water diving. You will not find temperate water diving better than that. Big walls, lots of fish. It's a marine reserve up north, well worth doing. And then way down south, there's one of our national parks called Fiordland. It's a World Heritage Wilderness Area. Massive valleys, glaciated valleys that, the mountains rise 5,000 feet straight out of the water and they go 5,000 feet straight down into the like it's an amazing place, and incredible clear water, but cold. But that's spectacular because of its just the natural beauty of the place. So we've got a big range of environments in New Zealand. It's probably not one of the greatest known dive destinations in the world, but certainly plenty of great diving to be had here.
Awesome, awesome. And so after you, or I guess at the point when you got old enough, you joined the military and continued your journey into diving there. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I'd done marine biology for about 6 or 7 years, and then at the age of 26, I went to medical school and graduated at 31, 32. It's a 6-year course here, and so that's when I joined the military. So I was already in my 30s, and like the military, anyone who's spent time in the military will tell you that it's, you have experiences that you would never really have anywhere else. I mean, I had some wonderful times. New Zealand doesn't get involved in too many wars, but we did a few sort of operational human, I don't know what you call it, like rescue things and doing good works around the Pacific, that kind of stuff. And I just absolutely loved it. But the big thing for me was the diving medicine side of it. At that time, the New Zealand military ran the only recompression chamber in New Zealand. And we had a large, exuberant population of divers who got themselves into trouble a fair bit. So as a place to learn diving medicine and get genuine experience-based expertise in treating decompression sickness, fabulous. It was just... we were treating 100 divers a year with decompression sickness in the 90s. And so I got to see a lot of cases, and that was really where I built my, my knowledge base, my experience base in diving medicine. Wonderful. Yeah, so I did about 9 years in the military, and in supporting our operational diving team, we were doing, attack swimming on oxygen rebreathers, deep diving on mixed gas rebreathers, deep diving on surface supply with wet bells. So lots of interesting diving experiences as well, which after I left the Navy, I kind of continued on with that in the form of technical diving.
Yeah, well, and that was going to be a question that I had. Your time in the military led you into that sort of technical diving, deeper dives, longer dives, decompression dives. And when that all started coming forward, was it just kind of the same as, your first recreational class, like, oh, this is exciting, I want to do more, how much further can I push this?
Yeah, well, I mean, ask yourself, what diver hasn't been swimming along a drop-off at, say, 20 meters, looking down this, abyss, this precipice going down to the depths, and thought, wow, I really want to go down there, but I can't because I'm wearing a single cylinder of air. And so when I left the Navy, I was full of knowledge about deep diving and mixed gases and stuff from, being part of the Navy dive team. And so I wanted to apply that to solve that exact problem. Like, I don't want to be on some drop-off wondering what's down there. I want to be going down there. And so very quickly I got, it was the late 90s, so rebreathers weren't a big thing. They were just really emerging into mainstream, particularly, mixed gas rebreathers, electronic closed-circuit rebreathers. So I got into that very early with a US Navy Mark 15.5 rebreather, and because I'd had some exposure to those in the military. The Australian Navy were using those at the time. We did a lot of work with them. So I wanted one of those, and they looked super cool, so that's very important. And so I bought one of these. There were some out there in the community, and all obtained by legal means, I must say. And that was where it kicked off. So I think 1998, 99, I started using mixed gas rebreathers and started doing deep diving.
So at that point, were you finding it difficult to find a team or find buddies to do this type of diving? Because like you said, it wasn't very big. I'm sure there wasn't a lot of people. And then at that point, with it being fairly new, how do you know you can trust somebody that you're about to go and do this massive dive with?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. It's exactly right. I would say that back at that time, teams tended to evolve rather than, you just knew people who had reputations in the field because kind of nobody did at that time. So you'd might start diving with some people and you would evolve your diving careers together. And I actually was in Brisbane, Australia at that time. So after I left the New Zealand Navy, I went to Brisbane to run a hyperbaric medicine unit there. And I fell in with a couple of guys who were rebreather diving. But you're right, I didn't really know much about them. I didn't know, whether I'd enjoy diving with these guys. And we started diving together and, just started doing incrementally bigger things. And that was a time that was really important in my diving development because there was a shipwreck there that it was a Second World War wreck of a hospital ship that had been torpedoed in the middle of the night off Brisbane in the Second World War, and 265 Australian servicemen and women, lots of medical people, had died. It was terrible, and that wreck had been discovered allegedly by a guy with an underwater robot about 10 years before, but no one had ever dived it. And it was in 180 meters of water, and no one had actually dived a shipwreck that deep ever, anywhere in the world. It was going to be the deepest shipwreck dive ever done. And we planned to dive it, and it took us maybe a year and a half of team building and practicing and working up to different depths, and we eventually did it. And interestingly, we discovered it was the wrong wreck. Like everyone was calling it this hospital ship, but actually it turned out that it wasn't the right wreck, which was, amazing because, well, it wasn't amazing is probably the wrong word. It was very controversial, the fact that we dived this wreck and found that it was the wrong wreck. It became a big news item in Australia, and we got a lot of attention, not all of it good attention either, because some people thought we shouldn't have dived this wreck because it was, a sacred war grave. But then when we said, well, it's actually not, it's the wrong wreck, that created, quite a big scandal. And eventually the government funded a search using one of the big ships, the ship that found the Bismarck in the North Atlantic. They went out and used side scan sonar and robots, and they found it. They actually found the real wreck, which is super cool because, the story had a good ending. Like we actually ended up finding the right wreck for people to throw wreaths on and all this kind of stuff. It's actually way deeper. It's about off the edge of the continental shelf, 2,000 meters. No one will ever dive it. But yeah, so that wreck, the Centaur, or the story of that wreck, was a major stepping stone in my development as a technical diver. And, a 180 meter dive back then in 2002, we did that dive, was a major deal. Like, well, it still is. I mean, 180 meters deep in anyone's terms, but back then it was super deep and the deepest wreck dive that have ever been done at that time. Now people have done deeper dives now, but yeah, that was a super cool story. But sorry, that was a very roundabout answer to your question about team building, but that is an example of exactly how that played out. We started diving together, we knew about this wreck, we planned to eventually dive it, and we ended up doing it.
Okay, no, that's a great answer, because then actually I have another question that goes into that. So you know at this point it's going to be, or did you know at the point it was going to be the deepest dive ever done up, like what before you were doing it, like, or was it just kind of like, oh, okay, we'll see how far we can get and then go from there? And then what? Talk about like the mindset going into something like that. Like where was your mind at, to be able to push it to that limit? Were you comfortable because of the training, or, obviously there had to have been some nerves in there to go and attempt something like that at the time?
Yeah, so a couple of good points come out of those questions. So we did know that it was the deepest wreck dive before we did it. But I do want to emphasize, Nick, that had nothing to do with the reason we were doing it.
Yes.
We did it. We did it because, it was a mystery. It was an important part of Australian maritime history. And we were very keen to, put a line under that. And And we did in a somewhat unexpected way, but that was the reason we did it. And so we weren't big on sort of banging on about, oh yeah, it's a world record wreck dive or anything like that. But inevitably that kind of talk happens. Yeah, so the mindset going into it, well, it was very much going into new territory. I ended up doing the dive with a guy who we had very complementary skill sets. So he was a very clever, practical guy, and he kind of managed the whole, the boat, the surface support, the support divers, the shot line, how we were going to drop the shot. Dropping a shot on a wreck from 180 meters above it is not an easy thing. You don't want to do a sand dive at 180 meters, right? So, all that kind of stuff. And my expertise was in the sort of diving physiology, medicine, decompression side of it. So that was the bit that, what gases are we going to breathe? What deco are we going to do? All that kind of stuff. Because there was no playbook, right? There's no recipe for this back then. And we went into it with a degree of nervousness for sure. And so you should. Like if you're doing something like this, a little bit of fear is not a bad thing because it keeps you sharp. We did lots of practice, lots of workup. I mean, I won't say it was perfect, but I think it was pretty good for the time. And we've carried on like that. I've been involved in quite a lot of stuff since then. Expedition type diving. And these recent expeditions I've done to the Pierce Resurgence with Richard Harris and the Wet Mules. Same thing. We're pushing boundaries deeper and longer and colder than most people have ever done, and you've got to have that front of mind, and you've got to that kind of fear drives you to be thorough and to be careful with your planning. So yeah, we don't worry, we were nervous all right.
Seeing some of the stuff that you've done, and I at some point I actually did want to ask about the Pierce Resurgence. Seeing some of the stuff that you've done, at what point are you like, no, like this is, do you kind of hit that point where you're like, okay, this is a little bit too much, or are you still on that like explorer side, like that wanting to know a little bit more? Does that question make sense?
Oh, no, it makes perfect sense. I think it kind of relates a bit to what I said before about not doing dives for records, but for a purpose, and for me, if there's a reason to do the dive that interests me enough, then yeah, I'm still at the sharp end. I'll do whatever it takes. The depth thing is a tool to get you to places that you otherwise couldn't go. It's not an end in itself. And yeah, there's got to be something that makes the risk worthwhile. And different people have different risk thermostats, and they have different things that interest them. So, like open disclosure, right? I'm not the diver that did the 250 meter dive in the Pierce. That was Richard Harris and Craig Challen. I mean, I took some video of them down to 130 meters, which was enough for me. And I'll tell you why I'm not particularly interested in diving to 250 meters in the Pierce, and that is that I actually am not that big on caves. I don't understand really. I don't have the same passion about being the person who sees another 30 meters of cave passage that no one else has seen that looks exactly like the 30 meters of cave passage you've just come through. It's, to me, that's not worth it. But to Harry and Craig, it is. And but equally, I really enjoy the challenge of organizing these, the logistics, the physiology, the planning, the all the things that go into planning and executing those kind of dives. I am passionate about that. So I've been part of those expeditions, but I haven't been, the one who did the 250 meter dives. I've been part of the, thing as a general whole. If you told me tomorrow that there was a wreck that hadn't been identified that might be of historical significance in 200 meters off the coast here, I'd be out there, in 2 picoseconds. So it's all about what turns you on, about what interests you and makes those risks worthwhile.
So, and I think I did find this out from my reading. So your passion lies in wrecks, obviously. So you're the wreck guy. Do you have some highlights of wrecks that you've been to, or anything on the books, like expeditions, anything that you could speak about? I'm not sure because I'm sure there's plenty of undiscovered wrecks just waiting to be found. So anything on that note?
Yeah, well, the wreck I've already told you about, the Centaur, that, discovering that was the wrong wreck and that leading to discovering the right wreck was a highlight. There's been a couple of others. We took a real interest in, actually, let me just say that unlike, the North Atlantic, where there's billions of wrecks, where the Second World War was raging and all that kind of stuff, round Australia and New Zealand, there's not that many wrecks. However, those that do exist, of course, because there's so few of them, they attract high levels of interest. And so one of the things that Australians and New Zealanders don't know a lot about is that in the First World War, there was a German raider down here in our waters. I mean, goodness knows what the Germans thought they were doing. I mean, it's the other side of the world. Why would they bother? But they were down here, and there was a ship called the Wolf, whose story is amazing in itself. Like, they were away from Germany for about 18 months. Germans thought she was gone, but they made it back. And they laid mines around the Australian and New Zealand coasts and sank ships off both coasts, and probably about 5 ships, I think. And we have been instrumental in locating and diving and identifying 2 of them. One off the New South Wales Victoria border in Australia, and one off the South Island in New Zealand. They're both in 100 metres of water, so they're both, significant depth. I think that was the depth they used to lay those mines, because the anchors were about, like a certain length long. So all of these wrecks that the Wolf sank are in about 100 metres of water, so 300 feet or so. And, we found 2 of them and dived them. And look, contributing to history, like answering questions about maritime history that is important to the countries that we live in, is such a satisfying thing. So yeah, I've done those 2 dives that were, amazing from that point of view. Wreck diving in general, I really enjoy. It doesn't worry me too much if other people have been to them first. That's still fine, especially if there's interest in them. So I love going to places like Truck Lagoon. I'm going back to Truck in November with Pete Mesley. He runs those trips up there, which are amazing. I've been to Truck about 5 or 6 times, and I've been to Bikini Atoll 4 times. I've done a lot of these very famous wreck diving places, and I never get tired of photographing the wrecks. That's one of the things that I really like, to try to capture something about these wrecks that sort of epitomizes what they are. So some quintessential photo of a particular wreck. So I have a lot of fun with that. Actually, one of the cool things about photography is, it is the never-ending challenge in diving, because you can never say you've got the best photo. There's always a better photo to take, and so I enjoy visiting these wrecks. I mean, every wreck diver's dream is the virgin wreck that's never been dived, and you dive it and identify it. And I've been lucky enough to do that on at least 3 occasions. So, you couldn't hope for more. Some people never get to do that, even once.
No, that's awesome. That's all. What do you shoot with?
Oh, camera wise,
Yeah.
I've got a Nikon D850 in a Nauticam housing, and a couple of strobes. But these days we're using movie lights a lot more for lighting our photographs. So I do a bit of both. But yeah, that's my sort of main. The camera's a D850 in a Nauticam housing. One of the things that we are doing quite a bit these days is playing around with these different techniques for lighting dark spaces, like the engine room on a ship, great big dark space, and, a couple of strobes going off just lights a tiny little bit of it in front of you. But Pete Mesley, in fact, has been at the forefront of developing these techniques where you put the camera on a tripod and you take multiple photos of the same frame with different bits of it lit up. It's amazing technique. And then you get this composite image that looks like, wow, how the hell did they do that? Because this big area underwater that's all lit up. So I'm doing a bit of that. Pete taught me that technique. I'm very grateful and having some fun with that. I'll be doing that at Truck when I go up there in November.
So I am not I do a little bit of land photography, and it's just a hobby, and I've at some points I've thought about incorporating underwater, but I feel like that's just a whole nother ballpark that I don't know if I want to get into, because that I you always kind of hear about people that go and dive with photographers. They're like, oh man, we gotta wait for the photographer. Do your buddies ever get annoyed with you because you're trying to get the shot and they're trying to move on?
There's yes. Well, first of all, let me tell you, photography is a financial black hole. So, if that bothers you, don't get into it. But yeah, there is that. Although the quintessential example of what you're talking about is the macro photographer who, has got their head buried in some weed somewhere, taking a photograph of a nudibranch for 10 minutes. Now, that will drive buddies mad. But the way to deal with your other concern is to dive with people who want their photos taken. Because photos always look better with a diver in them, and if you strategically position someone in a photo, always looks better. And of course, then the diver gets to use the photo. They can show people and say, "Hey, this is me. Doesn't that look cool?" So that's a good thing. So I generally dive with other photographers, and we might swap roles halfway through a dive, or there'll be something cool to take a photo of. So I'll take a photo with that person in the frame, and then we'll swap around. Pete and I do that quite a bit actually, so that works pretty well. So you can generally avoid annoying people with being a photographer, especially wide angle. Macro, I'll be honest, it's one of the times I occasionally do solo diving, because there's no one in their right mind would want to dive with you when you're doing macro photography.
Is there is there a lot of planning that goes into these shots? Like, okay, we're gonna go down here, this is the idea, or is it just kind of on the fly when you're down there?
It's mostly on the fly, although there are conspicuous exceptions to that. So sometimes you do go after a particular shot, and you know that's what you're going to do before you go on the dive, and so you talk about it and you try and make sure that no one else is going to go into wherever it is you're going to dive and silk the place up. And those light painting photos I was talking about before, where taking multiple photos of the same frame with different bits lit up and composite images, that can take a whole dive to take one photo. So that can be a real undertaking, and that of course is very carefully planned and choreographed. So there's lots of different levels of, from no planning on the fly to highly choreographed one photo for a whole dive kind of thing.
Okay. Do you have a favorite shot that you've taken?
Yeah, I've got a few. Some of those light painting photos, yeah, pretty amazing. I say that with all modesty. Like Pete's ones are way better than mine, but I've certainly had a few successes in that regard that I really like, and partly it's the fact that this is a major technical challenge, and like you come out of it with a pretty cool result. So yeah, looking on those with some satisfaction. Wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea. I mean, one of the funny things about photography, right, is I've got a whole lot of my photos in like you have a photo in a book or an album, and you can get people around at your house looking through them, and there's an engine room, and there's some gauges, and there's a telegraph, and there's a steering wheel, and they're like almost falling asleep and yawning, and then a picture of an anemone comes up, and they're like, oh my god, that's so beautiful, and it's like your least favorite photo in the whole collection, but that's what appeals to other people. So it's a lot of it's in the eye of the beholder, I can tell you.
Do you have just a random question, but do you have, like, if you were to name like top three photographers out there in your book that you like to see their photos, is there a top three, or?
That's a very difficult thing, but I would say there are some people who I really. So Pete Mesley is one of them, and I mean I think Pete is widely recognised as the best light painting underwater photographer in the world. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. The other person who I really admire, I think is terrific, and I've been lucky to dive with her a few times. Becky Kagan Scott. I don't know if you've ever come across her, but very well known American photographer, and we've been to truck together a few times. Actually, we've dived in New Zealand together a couple of times, and if you look at her work, it's incredibly creative and thoughtful and technically excellent. And she goes everywhere, like she's very eclectic in her taste, travels the world taking photos of all these different things. I've got a huge amount of time and respect for Becky as a photographer. There's been others over the years, but if I say too many more, that people will get annoyed for me leaving them out. So
No, no, understandable. And then back to the wrecks. Have you ever been to the Great Lakes, or is that on your radar?
no, but it's very much on my radar. So I haven't, but Pete has, and he's come back with some just unbelievable stuff. Absolutely beautiful. And in fact, he several of his trips have been with Becky, and she's taken some amazing Great Lakes photos as well. Some of those photos of the sailing ship, absolutely beautiful in that super clear, deep darkish water, very moody photographs. And, there's some, amazing examples of technically excellent photographs come out of the Great Lakes, no question.
Yeah, no, it's actually, even me being from the U.S., I've probably driven through, but I've definitely never been diving there. And I know most of, or I don't want to say most, but quite a few of the wrecks there are definitely a little bit deeper. But it's pretty cool. I was speaking with a gentleman not too long ago, who he was a part of a team that found a locomotive that had been kind of not missing, but it's a cool story. It just got derailed, sunk, and a couple people like, oh yeah, the stories are over here, and he actually went out there and found it with his group, and that would be kind of a sight to see. But and me personally, I'm not a technical diver. I'm just kind of got my foot in the door, but just seeing some of these wrecks, a 100-year-old wooden shipwreck that just looks exactly the same as the day it sank must be, talk about a blast from the past, especially if you're into history. So it's something that's on my radar, but there's no time. I don't have a time frame of when I would be able to get there, but definitely I would like to make it out there at some point in time.
Yeah, Pete's been at me to go to the Great Lakes with him a few times. I've got this image in my head of one of his photos, and I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's a sailing ship, and I think it's called the Typo, like as in typo, mistaken typing, but it's obviously wasn't that, but Typo, and incredible photograph, absolutely beautiful. So yeah, very much on my radar, and it's cold and deep though. You're right, and you need to be a competent technical diver. To get those kind of photos, you need time underwater, which is what rebreathers give you. You've got this time to do stuff without worrying too much about gas supply. And, you need to be confident in dry suits and all that kind of stuff.
So with the, massive scale of impressive dives that you've done, do you ever go out and just do single tank vacation diving? Is that still type of diving? Like, is that even on your radar these days? Do you still do that type of diving?
Yeah, sure it is. And actually, it's a really important point you make, Nick. Like people, when I talk to divers who aren't technical divers, they almost sound apologetic for like they consider the depths they go to be pathetic in some way, and I'm at great pains to point out that I am not a depth snob. Like there's still lots of great reasons to go diving in shallow waters. And like I said before, depth is only a tool. It gets you to places you otherwise couldn't go. And actually, it's a hassle because if you go deep and for a long time, you have these massive decompressions and the risk of the dives increases. So I really enjoy the occasion. I don't actually dive single cylinder scuba air very often because mostly that's not the sort of diving I do. But when I do it, I love it because it's so frigging easy. Like you just chuck that thing on and, away you go. And I've actually just been to Fiji for a few weeks with that friend I was telling you about before that I grew up with, Bill Day. He's got a motor yacht. He keeps it up there in our winter, and we've just had a trip for 2 weeks. And we had some marvelous diving experiences. In fact, I've been diving all my life, and I've read about them, but I had never seen what is often referred to as an anemone city. So it was this little reef in a bay that no one would ever really think to dive because we only went in there to anchor. It was kind of sheltered. And it's just me because I love diving so much. It kind of speaks to your question, actually. I just jump in the water because it's in the water and I can swim around. It doesn't really matter if it's just mud. I still see a few interesting things. So I just chucked a scuba cylinder on my back and swimming around this relatively shallow bay, just looking for anything to see. And I came across this little reef and it literally was covered in anemones, like thousands of clownfish and anemones wall to wall. I've never seen anything like it. And that was a scuba air dive. And that would be in my top 10 diving experiences, right there. So yeah, sure. Of course I go scuba diving and I really enjoy it when I do.
No, that's great. Because it is nice because I definitely you come across people sometimes that are like, oh, this is the only type of diving. You gotta go out and do this and I'm still at the point where I just enjoy all of it. I like the 10-meter reef dive, the dirty lake dive. Just getting in the water is as much as I can is an absolute positive. Unfortunately, I don't know if you're familiar with the Malaysia, the Penang area of Malaysia. That's where I'm based out of right now. There is no really diving around here in the Strait of Malacca. I guess there's a few shipwrecks around in the strait. I mean, there has to be plenty. It's been well traveled for a very long time. But definitely, there's no day charters going out or anything. So anytime that I want to go out, I have to usually hop on a plane for about an hour, which isn't the worst thing, but definitely kind of makes it to where I'm not out there every weekend as much as I would like to. So what's your next destination, your next trip? Got anything coming on the books anytime soon?
Yeah, well, I'm going to truck in November. Yeah, so that's for 2 and a bit weeks. Pete always takes a doctor on his trips because he might have 40 rebreather divers doing moderately, aggressive is probably the wrong word, but full on technical diving for 2 weeks. There's often some problems associated with that, decompression sickness type problems. So he's kind of got this view that he feels responsible for making sure there's good medical care for his clients. So he always takes a doctor, and I go along on these trips when I can. So yeah, I'm doing that one. I've just come back from, you were talking about Malaysia. I've just been there. So I was in Borneo at Kota Kinabalu for a couple of weeks. And there's some great diving over there. I've also dived at Redang and Pulau Tioman in Malaysia and Langkawi, which is fairly, well, a bit north of where you are. But yeah, so what else? Oh, well, truck's the next big expedition. But, we try to go diving up at the Poor Knights, that place I mentioned earlier, every few weeks just to keep in the groove. Rebreathers are not the sort of thing that you can just chuck in a cupboard and pull out 6 months later and hope it's all going to work. You need to keep diving them, and it helps you stay in the groove with them as well. Before the last Pierce expedition in February, I actually spent a week out on a boat here just doing some relatively shallow rebreather diving just to get myself really dived in. I think it's a real mistake if you go on a major expedition that's got specific goals, not having dived your rebreather for 5 months. I think that's a really stupid idea. So staying in the groove is very important.
Yeah. What unit do you dive now?
I'm diving an Inspo. Yeah. So the British AP Diving Inspiration rebreather. So it's a cool little unit. I've been diving it for quite a few years. I mean, look, I'm not. In my position, I'm quite careful not to, sort of overtly endorse specific brands of rebreathers. I'm not in it for that game. I mean, part of the reason I dive it is I've been diving one for years. It's always worked well for me. It has all the capabilities I want, and I'm used to it. I do a lot of rebreather diving, but not enough to own 3 units and be familiar with all of them, you know. So, some people will talk to you, oh, I've got 6 rebreathers. Well, great if you're doing a lot of rebreather diving, but I stick to the 1 unit. I don't have the US Navy unit anymore, but there's lots of good rebreathers out there, and I'm loath to endorse one over the other. And in fact, the major considerations with what rebreather you buy is kind of, well, things like who am I going to dive with? What unit do they dive? Because being familiar with your buddy's equipment is really an advantage. Where is the factory for these things? Can I get it serviced easily? All those sorts of things are the key considerations. Now, the fact that I live in New Zealand and the Inspiration factories in the UK isn't a very good example of what I just said, but then there's no one who makes rebreathers in New Zealand. So whatever unit I use, it's going to be going halfway around the world or all the way around the world for servicing and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's lots of cool devices out there now, and the quality and safety of them has improved a lot over the years.
Yeah, no, and I'm excited to see what is in store for the future. And then obviously I'm you're going to be part of, hopefully you'll be part of the group that I got together to be able to kind of speak about that, because it's pretty exciting to see, obviously, in the last 10 years where it's come, and then where you kind of think it's going to go in the next 10 years. So just a random question. What were you doing? What kind of diving were you doing in you said you were in Kota Kinabalu for a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I was. Yeah. Look, the only diving I did there was over the other side, near Sipadan, not at Sipadan. Okay. And to be honest with you, it was just snorkeling with my wife. In fact, the major purpose of our visit was I was speaking at a conference, and then I just wanted to. She's always had this thing about orangutans, and we sponsor an orangutan allegedly. So we wanted to go and visit these orangutan places, and we did a couple of days at a rainforest lodge, and we actually saw them in the wild, which was wonderful for my wife Shan. And so yeah, it wasn't a diving trip, to be perfectly honest. It was.
No, that's I have not been, but it's on the radar to make it to that area. Well, definitely for the diving, but just to do some land exploration too, because there's a lot of cool stuff to see down there, and there's a big. I don't think there's any cave diving or anything. Not that I'm a cave diver, but I know there's a big cave system there that's supposed to be a very beautiful sight to see. And obviously, me living in Malaysia, I'm trying to explore Malaysia as much as possible. And then back to it's oddly enough, the only place that I've been diving besides a pool in Malaysia is Langkawi, and obviously that's not known for its great diving, but I had a really good time because it's really, really close. It's like a 20-minute plane ride, so it we can hop over there very quickly. But no, I want to thank you very, very much. I know there's probably a lot of different avenues that we could have gone down, but I just kind of wanted to get to know you as a diver a little bit. So I really want to thank you for coming onto the podcast today. And just one last question before I let you go. If you were to give any piece of advice, or not piece of advice, I should say. So if you were looking at the Simon Mitchell in his early 20s, and you wanted to give him a piece of advice, what would that be? Or any new diver, or just kind of diver in general, what advice? And I'm sure there's a lot, but I don't know if there's any that come to the top of your mind.
Well, there's one thing that does strike me. Back when I was at that phase of my career, the only pathway to advance yourself was into instruction. I'm going to become an open water diver, advanced diver, rescue diver, dive master, and instructor. That was the pathway. And, a lot of people went down that just to progress themselves, as I did, became a diving instructor. However, and there's nothing wrong with doing that, by the way. If you want to teach, great, perfect. But the really exciting thing about diving now is that there's an entirely parallel and different pathway, which is opened up as a result of technical diving. So, instead of becoming a dive master and instructor, you can become a, decompression procedures diver, and then a normoxic trimix diver and then advanced trimix. There's this hierarchy of technical diving courses. And why am I saying this? It's because what those courses do is they enhance the scope of your diving. In other words, the depth and time capabilities that you have. Ultimately maybe rebreathers. It's mixed gas diving. Those things change your diving capability. Becoming a diving instructor allows you to teach, but it doesn't really change. You're still a scuba air diver, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not knocking diving instruction. I had a wonderful time doing it. I'm just pointing out that for the 20-something people these days, there's this entirely new and extremely exciting path that they can take into this amazing sport. And I think that people need to think, when they get to that stage of their career, what is it that I want to do? Do I want to go down the instruction path, or do I want to actually enhance my diving capability and go down the technical diving path? And both are great things, but that's available now. It wasn't in my day. So there you go. That's my intuitive answer to that question. Yeah.
Simon, thank you very, very much for coming on to the podcast today, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, Nick. It's a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Off-Gassing, a scuba podcast.